This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager. Can you give me your name and job title, please?
Hi, I'm Tim Wigmore. I'm a co-author of White Hot.
Oh, you didn't do the subtitle. So I've also done podcasts with Roller, and he goes all the way through the subtitle. So
I didn't need to hear that, but you can have it if you want.
No, White Hot. Tim Wigmore is White Hot. That's all you need to know, everyone. Take me through why 1989 to 1991 is important for England modern white ball cricket.
So you have an incredible amount of talent born in these couple of years. You have Joss Buttler, Johnny Bairstow, Jason Roy, Alex Hales, Joe Root, and Ben Stokes. And you also have guys who probably would have been real stars in any other era. You have James Vince, Sam Billings, and James Taylor.
Was Moeen Ali born in that era too, or is he just a little bit out of it?
He's 87, I think, okay. And David Milan is 87 as well. And Morgan, I think, is 86. So they're like a half generation older.
Yeah. And so you compare it to, in your book, White Hot, whatever the subtitle of that book is, to the Silicon Valley Golden Generation. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so basically the Silicon Valley Golden Generation, as sort of Malcolm Gladwell and others know, is you have a lot of guys who are all born in the mid-1950s, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and so on. They're all born in 1955 alone, those guys. So you have, and they all become adults and get to university in 1975, which is basically when personal computers are starting. So they're like the perfect time, because if they were any older, they'd already got other jobs, they wouldn't be able to benefit from this. And if they were any younger, they'd have a generation who were above them who were already doing that. So there was a kind of a sweet spot of being born. And it seems to be the same for England in white ball cricket, because basically if you're any older than born in 89, you don't really grow up with T20 in quite the same way, because even though it launched in 03, it takes a few years for it to kind of mature and develop. And really, it's arguably the IPL in 08 that really elevates it. And of course, if you're any younger, you've already got guys above you who've grown up as the first generation of T20. So that is part of it. And of course, we have the Pro 40, which I know is one of your obsessions, Jarrod.
We'll get to the Pro 40. Don't worry about that. Eventually, I'll probably do an entire chat with myself just on the Pro 40. So the first T20 generation. But before we get to the T20 for a moment, the other interesting thing is the Bunbury Festival, which I don't think a lot of people outside of English cricket would know anything about.
Sorry, the other thing before?
Bunbury Festival.
Yes. So the Bunbury Festival, you have this annual festival, normally involving kind of 4 underage teams, under 15 teams, which is in Bunbury with David English, who was the kind of driving force, who actually passed away a couple of years ago, and I think it was 9 members of the 2015 World Cup squad had come through the Bunbury Festival.
And
so
who was David English?
David English, he used to be president of RSO Records, so he signed the Bee Gees and Eric Clapton. And he's a cricket nut, and he basically thinks that we need a way to develop kids from between being at school and a kind of a pathway between there and kind of professional cricket and under 19 cricket. So he organises this sort of 4 or 5 day festival, and it's basically where all the young players all start to play together, and they meet each other. And there's the Peri Peri sauce incident in 2006, where Ben Stokes puts Peri Peri sauce in Sam Billings' in his Coca-Cola, and Billings to go to the toilet. And he tells us he ended up being sick in the toilet, Sam Billings. So yeah, the Peri Peri Wars of 2006, but they're the sort of start for the golden generation.
And so that generation, and a lot of players obviously came through that Bunbury Festival, but that generation, because they're all the same age, it was obviously abnormally strong at that point. And the same thing sort of happens at under 19 level as well, doesn't it? Where's Wigmore gone?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. So the same thing happens at under 19 level as well.
Yeah, so that Bunbury group, they all end up kind of at under 19 level. And again, England has a very strong under 19 system because of all these guys being the same age.
Yeah, that's right. Although the kind of interesting thing is England under-19 cricket, they're never very successful, actually. They obviously win the World Cup in 98, but that's this kind of weird one-off. And English players tend to develop a little bit later, so they don't actually have that much success in the under-19 World Cup, although there's little moments. There's a century that Stokes scores against India, which is seen as a big moment. And actually, weirdly, one of the biggest moments of under-19 cricket for this generation is nothing that happens on the pitch. It's this debrief that Joe Root has in 2010. So after the under-19 World Cup in 2010, the coach is Mark Robinson, and he has a debrief with all the players, and he basically tells Joe Root that, you're much too limited. You're never going to make it. Probably not going to make it even for Yorkshire white ball cricket unless you really transform your game. And then you kind of look at it and you're like, maybe this is rubbish. But actually, so under 19 record for England, Root plays 16 ODIs, averages 30, a strike rate of 56, which is England in the 1990s kind of vibe. So maybe what Mark Robinson said, there was something in it. And we talked to Root, and he talks about how he was obviously very, very angry, and he thought it was a very kind of destructive thing to say to a young player, which you can see that. But actually, it was also the catalyst for him to develop his game. So, Root's never going to be the most powerful guy. Of that kind of group of 9, he was the one who was kind of most naturally suited to red ball rather than white ball. But he develops his scooping, his reverse scooping. Those are big things he develops. He becomes very, very destructive against spin, and he becomes basically a master of manoeuvring the ball into gaps. And actually, we see that Root is a king of what England call the cruising speed, which is he's able to score at a strike rate of 90-95 in the middle overs, basically without really taking risks. So he has this very, very high average, especially in the World Cup cycle from 15 to 19. So he actually, he has this chat, and he's behind, and it helps to kick him into gear. And then you go, and then actually he talks about, again, you have the competition. So the fact that everyone else is so destructive, and actually, so Joss Buttler, whenever you talk to people, he's the one that stands up more than anyone else. So you think of there's kind of, it's inevitable that he'll go on, but actually it's not quite that simple, because another guy everyone talks about is Jordan Clark. So Jordan Clark is seen as almost as good as Buttler by a lot of people, and he's gone on to have a good county career, but he's never really been close to England. So it doesn't always mean, it's not written in the stars quite like that. But actually, I think the level of competition just drive people forward. And actually, these are the first guys that they don't really look down on white ball cricket. And so, we talked with Sam Billings, and he said, actually, as a kid, for Kent, the first thing he'd look at was basically, the T20 games at the Oval and Lords for Kent and the Blast. They were the big ticket events, because actually, there's going to be a huge crowd. It's going to be really an exciting occasion. And that's a bit of a difference as well. So this group have slightly different priorities as well. And actually, you don't have a generation who is all about Test cricket. They've these broader ambitions, and actually the odd thing is it takes the England hierarchy, the England management, a while to kind of catch up with where the players actually are at.
Well, the whole thing about the England players thinking about white ball cricket, it reminded me of when Australia won 99, 2003, and 2007. I interviewed Ricky Ponting a few years ago, and one of my first questions to him was, "Why did you take it so serious?" No one else was taking it serious. And he said that he grew up watching it on TV, and he didn't realize when he was young that the players weren't taking one-day cricket seriously. They were out there, they had their canary yellows on it. That, Dean Jones is running down the wicket and flicking England into the stands and all this sort of stuff. And in his mind, it was supposed to be taken seriously. And it does feel like the West Indians in T20 cricket is another really good example of this. Is sometimes if you have a whole generation of players, for whatever reason, who just go, "Oh, this is our thing," you actually have this incredible advantage over the rest of the world, when the rest of the world's like, "Wow, T20, we'll make a bit of money off it, but we don't take it seriously." Whereas Dwayne Bravo and Kyron Pollard are out there working micro strategies out of, how to get the most out of each ball. And it does feel like reading this generation of English cricket, even if it didn't show in the senior team for ages, Joss Buttler clearly thought about batting in a way that other players didn't. And again, with all due respect to, Virat Kohli, Steve Smith, and Kane Williamson, I'm not sure any of them would have completely remodeled their game based on an under-19 coach, coming to them and telling, there was a lot of interesting things that sort of all come together. And obviously Mark Robinson becomes a very well-respected coach. He won the Women's World Cup as well. Yeah. So he's a proper coach's coach. But even so, I'm not saying that Steve Smith didn't have a great coach, and Kane Williamson and Virat Kohli, they all had different mentors that helped them. I'm not sure any of them would have sat down a 19-year-old phenom and just said, "You're not good enough. You may not even play domestic cricket. You're a complete waste." There's a lot of different things that sort of come together in that one moment. But I do think the seriousness of which Joe Root takes white ball cricket specifically is quite interesting. And then the fact that people like Josh Butler and Ben Stokes and these other guys were all thinking about it differently already.
Yeah, there's one thing we haven't talked about is money and finances and financial incentives. And actually, because the T20 Blast from about at this point in the early 2010s has 16 games in the group stage. It's really, really bloated, and then you have knockouts afterwards. So you're playing up to 19 games a season. So that's a lot of games. So a lot of practice, plus counties, they make a lot of money from the Blast. It basically keeps them afloat. So actually it's a really big part of their thinking. And probably talked about Australia more so than in Australia, because the Big Bash at this point is a small competition in terms of the number of games. I suppose you're almost pre-Big Bash, but you know what I mean? In terms of the state bash is a very small. So actually because the T20 Blast is so successful so early, English cricket does a classic thing of scheduling probably far too many matches, which is a negative in many ways, but it's also a positive in some ways. So there's a big financial incentive, and then, of course, you have the IPL as well. So actually, you have a situation so before the 2015 World Cup, this generation is sort of 23, 24. So there's already signs there, and actually, some people are arguing for them to be picked a lot earlier, but England are very reluctant. So you have this weird situation with Alex Hales. He's number one ranked T20 batsman in the world, and England just don't pick him for years, and when they do, they pick him out of position at number 3. There's this interview with Graham Swan in August 2014, I think, when he basically says, we have a generation who will win us a World Cup, which is the generation of, Morgan he references, of course, but also he talks about Hales, Roy, Vince, and Butler, all of which who will do win a World Cup 4 years later. So actually, England 2015, I don't think they were ever going to win it because the generation were too young. But there's definitely, England in 2015, they have the perfect approach from 2 years out, and they get to the semi-finals and they play in the right way, and it's actually seen as a perfect development before what happens 4 years later. Instead, it's perfect in a different way because it's so bad that it's the ground zero and you rip up everything. But England had this Lions tour to South Africa in January 2015, so just a month before their World Cup disaster class. They scored 370 twice. Ben Stokes scores 150. There's some thrilling cricket, and this is a team who's ready to go, really. And it takes the World Cup disaster for them to actually be unleashed. So actually, but this is interesting because we talk about the World Cup as being the catalyst, and that is true in many ways, but it couldn't be a catalyst if there weren't a generation already there. Otherwise, you think it would still take 5 years after that. So the fact is, this generation have already been reared. They are ready to go. You just need then the leadership to actually embrace them, which finally does happen. But the point is, England already have a group of players who are perfectly suited to playing in this way.
Yeah, so I had Matt on talking about something else from your book the other day, and we talked a little bit about the Australia A situation. I think it was the Pakistan games we were talking about, where England's third 11 beat Pakistan, right? And a very good, strong Pakistan. 21. Yeah, and you look at that Australia A team in what was it, 1994, 1995? Yeah, that summer. Yeah. So they had Greg Blewett, Matt Hayden, Damien Martin, Michael Bevan, Justin Langer, Ricky Ponting. The bowling wasn't as good, although they did have, I think they had Paul Rifle and Merv Hughes. So Paul Rifle was certainly going to be one, but Merv Hughes was, trying to fight his way back into the team, right? But you look at that batting lineup, and it's essentially the batting lineup that sort of changes the way that Australia play cricket, right? Bevan becomes, this uber specialist. Ponting becomes probably the best ODI player in the world for a little period of time. Hayden becomes Hayden. You also have Damien Martin. Like, it's a really, really, it's clear that there was a generation there as well, right? And yet Australia was in a different situation. But again, you do see these situations where it's almost like the national selectors are, in both situations, were holding on to older, more experienced, better red ball players rather than just letting go with this other generation of players. And, for those who don't know, Australia A almost beat the major team without really a bowling attack, right? Like, it was a very, very...
They beat England, famously.
We have that, I mean... Yeah. But the point being that we have seen this again, that there have been times when teams have just not worked out, that there is a whole generation of players coming through because it doesn't fit the way they currently think about the sport, right? And I think that's what was happening there. The other thing, you talked about money, private schools. right? A lot of these players come from a private school background, right?
Yeah, so 7 of the group of 9 go to private schools at some point. We should say at some point because a lot of them do get scholarships. Joe is 15 by the time he goes. So you also have this debate in England about, in that situation, do the private schools, do they make the players, or are they actually kind of taking the players when they're almost fully made and using them as a marketing tool? It's a combination of both, but I don't think it's irrelevant they go to private schools. And actually, the players we talk to, they talk about actually what do they get from these schools. Well, obviously, the facilities. Remember, with batting, if you're batting on a good wicket, that really suits what you get in white ball cricket. You can hit through the line of the ball and everything. You obviously, for your kind of physical athleticism and physical development, is a huge thing. And a lot of these guys, they play a lot of other sports and are very good at those other sports. So this is, we talked with England youth coaches, and they would say this was a very athletic, unusually athletic group by English standards, and that was true all the way through. So they have this kind of physical robustness, this most development skills. So that's a real striking feature. And a lot of this group, they become exceptional as fielders in the deep. And obviously, you have several wicket keepers who are also very good fielders when they field in the deep as well. So that's a really striking part of it. And I think that does speak to the kind of slightly un-English tendency of this group. So you have a whole new generation, and of course they then come. And then they basically, if you make your debut between 2009 and 2013 in county cricket, that's a time when you have 16 blast matches, huge number, and you have Pro 40, which I think is 8 group games at the time. And so that's 24 games a season. So again, those incentives, and of course, it's all shorter than 50 overs. And I think the other kind of fundamental thing, you think of English 50 over cricket in a nutshell, of failing is, as you said, they play like it's a red ball game. And so by playing 40 and 20 overs, that's a kind of artificial way of correcting against that. So you don't have guys who are worried about batting the overs. You actually have, which England have generally been pretty good at batting the overs, not very good at scoring fast enough, with the kind of absolute classic case study, the World Cup quarter-final against Sri Lanka in 2011, when they scored 2-3-9 for 8, and they're already happy, and they get stuffed, lose by 10 wickets. This new generation, the whole point is they're reared to play in a different way. And this strike rate, I know you've written about this, but the strike rates of these guys in Pro 40 is unbelievable. You have a Butler with strike rate of 129, and I think you have 3 other guys strike rate of over 100, and they're scoring have a good average as well. So they're not just
I think my memory of the Pro 40 was, and I know I sent you the piece, so you probably remember it better than I do, but I haven't read it in a while. But my memory of the Pro 40 stats was that every one of those players had a strong average and a strong strike rate year that on its own should have been enough to get them picked for England. Like, there was, every one of them had a year where they averaged 40 plus at a strike rate well over 100. And it did, and then with
the exception of Joe Root.
Yeah, exactly. Joe Root's the only one that sort of does it in that period, which of course he's still developing as a player. But all the rest of those guys, even guys like Dawid Malan, had really strong Pro 40 years at time. And it goes back to the comment you made before about the cruising speed, right? The power stuff, I don't think England did the power stuff better than the West Indies did, right? And from that point of view, England have been incredible. And they might go on to still be a better power team than West Indies have ever been. But the thing that no one could catch up to England, and it's exactly the same now in Test cricket, in baseball as well, is that ability to score at near enough to run a ball without losing any wickets at all, and putting so much pressure on the opposition. And that is, when I came over to the UK in 2008, when I watched Pro 40 games, that was the thing I had never seen before, right? It didn't exist in one-day cricket in Australia. One-day cricket in Australia, I'm talking List A cricket here, but teams would take that time off. And, you would look at even the great Sri Lankan team that was famous for being exciting, they would take those middle overs off, whereas England domestic players were just putting so much pressure on everyone in those middle overs. And it has to be, and I mean, it's impossible not to say this, but it has to be the fact that you took 10 overs out of that game and it was a 40-over game on top of the combination of T20 cricket coming through. And it's those two things happening at the same time that just completely changed the way that England players were trained compared to everyone else in the world.
Yeah, and maybe the third thing is that there's middle overs in the Pro 40. You only had 4 men out as well.
Yeah.
So again, that's replicating what becomes ODI cricket from 2015 onwards. So it's a perfect storm. We talked to Matthew Mott, who's obviously now the England coach. He was the Morgan coach from 2011 to 2013, and he said he did see some big differences compared to Australia. And he said basically you didn't have that second and third gear in the middle overs. Something was happening. There was more adventurous kind of style. And yeah, players were very, very smart. They really, you can score at 6-7 over in the middle overs without taking too many risks, you should be able to get a boundary every 2 or 3 overs, and there's lots of singles and twos. And again, actually, if you look at the group of 9 as a whole, they're very fast runs between the wickets as well, which is really important. Again, not the most English thing.
You said this before, but you mentioned it, but you do talk about it a bit more in the book, the athleticism side of things. So if you do look at the great white ball teams, but even the great test teams, Australia, West Indies, and South Africa, very athletic teams. Right? Very consistently athletic teams. Like you look at those players, you look at players like Andrew Simons and Herschel Gibbs and Clive Lloyd all the way through, and you had these incredible athletes who would play cricket.
AB de Villiers.
Yeah, there's so many of them from the West Indies, Australia, and South Africa. It's phenomenal how many that you see come through that system. And you look at England cricketers, and even when you have someone like Botham, who is an incredible athlete, by 4 years into his career, a lot of his athleticism is gone. Wasn't Mike Gatting a good football player when he was young as well? There was a lot of guys who had other skills, other athleticism, and something about English cricket just completely ruined the athleticism that any of these guys had, and they end up not being like that, right? They end up being really highly specialized cricket skill people and not athletic. And if you look at this whole modern period of English cricket, it does feel like something has changed, right? And you can go, Jimmy Anderson's another big part of this, right? But even someone like Moeen Ali, this sort of natural live kind of athlete didn't exist beforehand in English cricket. So there had to have been a movement towards that. So how much of that was just they had a bunch of athletes and then they copied that? Or how much was they really realized that they were falling behind when it comes to athleticism?
Yeah, so there's a bit of luck, a bit of kind of perfect storm, but there's something else. So in terms of the money is actually an important part of this story. So with Jason Roy, for example, he was offered academy deals age 17 in rugby by Wasps and Harlequins. And we'll never know, but it's fair to say that had there not been more money in English cricket by this point, someone like him might have been lost to cricket. And that's, so again, I know this is a very Australian thing to be worried about, the relative appeal of cricket for multi-sport guys, but I think cricket does become more, through T20 becomes more attractive, and it's just a really fun game to play for these guys, which kind of suits them if you're good at other sports. So I think that the money is part of it. I think there's a cohort effect as well, where they drive each other on, and it does seem to be a kind of era where there are more sports scholarships offered. It's almost the peak of the arms race in between private schools for sporting talent. So that's just a kind of luck in terms of when they come through. So you have guys, again, they probably would have been good at cricket. Joe Root's not. He's probably not made a great cricketer by going to workshop by getting a scholarship. But I think going to workshop makes him a better athlete. And it gives him those other sports skills, which is important. And we talked about the fitness, running between the wickets, the fielding. So in that sense, yeah, it's not a coincidence. And the fact that these schools are kind of competing, they're often competing for these specific players, that is really important. And so it all kind of comes together. And the fact is, because of cricket becoming more attractive, which is largely because of T20, actually these guys, they pursue cricket. Different generation, who knows, they might not, when there was less money in the game and it probably suited their personalities less, they might not have done. Sam Billings taught us that it wasn't just the kind of money of T20, but also it suits the personalities of the whole group of 9 he talked about. He suits them down to the ground, that kind of adrenaline rush, that sense of being the stars and the crowd and everything. It suits their personalities probably more than playing in the County Championship in April and May.
Yeah, playing on a wet Wednesday in Northants. It's worth noting just how bad it was, because there's a whole generation who are now used to England being good for the last 8 years, right? And so if you're 18 now and you're following this podcast, people don't actually understand how bad one-day cricket was. And obviously the best book is what's it called? 28 Days Data?
28 Days.
Yeah, which really takes you through how bad it was.
The prequel to our book.
Yeah, basically. Exactly. And one of the great lines that you quoted in this book, which I'd forgotten, was Andrew Strauss, who said that 2 3s are as good as a 6, which is such a mathematical head fuck when you listen to it. You're just like, wait, what? But
it's also not true, because it uses twice.
That's what I mean. Balls. From a mathematical point of view, you straight away, well, how could that be the case? But also, And I forgot to Google this, so I think I'm right. Ben Stokes doesn't play in the 2015 World Cup, does he?
Exactly, he doesn't. He's busy playing in South Africa, smashing 150 for the England Lions, which again shows the guys were there, they just weren't being picked. England picked Ravi Bopara ahead of him in the squad. They then don't pick Bopara, and they have the famous thing where James Taylor's doing pretty well as their number 3, and then they move him down to number 6, and they have Gary Balance, Joe Root, and James Taylor all in the same team. So you basically have 3 anchors. England then going forward only have one of those guys.
So it does show you just how far and how quickly everything changed. But we know the Trevor Bayliss side of things and the Owen Morgan side of things and the Andrew Strauss side of things. The other thing that I found interesting from your piece is just how much the players did take control. I know Morgan was one of them, but it wasn't just Morgan. It was that whole movement of that sort of golden generation that you talk about. They actually start to have a very, very big say in, the way that they play, the way that they prepare, and also the way they look for other talented players who are coming through. There's no doubt that because they were coming into a broken system and they played in a certain way, and Owen Morgan was given this license, and Trevor Bayliss freed up a lot of them, and Andrew Strauss was backing them. But the players themselves were not just pawns. They were very much part of the movement that changed English cricket.
So in that Lions tour to South Africa in 2015, the players... this incredible tour, so England score 376 for 9 and 378 for 6, and the players basically all say this is the way we have to keep on playing. So the players know where the future is. Interestingly, Andy Flower is coach on this Lions tour, and it seems to be, from all accounts that we talked to, a very different Andy Flower to what we associate with the England, the kind of Flower boy years. Actually,
the angry Flower, the disciplinarian Flower.
It's very much now. Andy Flower wants them to go and explore themselves. He's actually very good at Andy Flower and Graham Fulper on that tour, and they're very good at actually encouraging the players to go and explore their capabilities. So that's important. So it's a slightly new style of coaching, which benefits these players as well. There is that ownership. England, you could say the England management deserve a little bit of credit. So one of the things is interesting. The England Lions, their number of one-day matches doubles between 05 and 09, and then 2010 and 14. So actually you have, again, what you have in a lot of international football teams who are very, very successful. You have a generation who grew up together, used to winning together, and then they all kind of obviously come to the national team at the same time. So actually, and that probably makes the style side of things easier for England, the full team, because you have everyone knows how everyone else plays, and you have that kind of level of trust already. Because remember, Owen Morgan, he's generally the oldest player in that team, and it's a very, very young team after 2015. So he's kind of the only adult in the room, and it's a really young team, and they're very much encouraged to just keep on playing as they have done for the Lions. So everything kind of comes together in such a perfect way that it's a combination of just kind of sheer luck and happenstance, and there's kind of planning lower down. But I think that the point is that these players do exist before England just shackling them. They don't want to liberate them. But when 2015 happens, they realise that they need to change the style of play, and because of all these factors. And really, this is a story that is, it's not really an England planning story. It's more a series of factors. England get lucky because of the way things are. It's not really an England master plan, but England are able to benefit from a system, this kind of happy coincidence, if you like, that these players do all exist, and suddenly they're ready to play in this whole different way. So England really from rubble find themselves with a golden generation, and actually there's a lot of players in this generation. We talked about Vince, James Taylor obviously has to retire early, Sam Billings. It's fair to say that in probably any other England era, these guys would not just be regulars, they'd probably be captaining in white ball cricket at a certain point as well. So that's the kind of amount of depth. So again, you talked about that Australia A example, and actually the fact we had that COVID series against Pakistan shows that England A effectively have got to a similar point, and that speaks to just the sheer depth of the kind of cultural change in English cricket, and you've seen the whole image just completely transformed overnight. So we no longer think of England as being Mr. 2 3s are as good as a 6.
Here's my last question. I think I might have asked this to Roller as well, because you keep talking about a golden generation. The problem with golden generations is that when they finish,
they do,
right? And this is you talked about it being a young team in 2015. It's not a young team anymore. And I've had a lot of England fans over the last couple of years say, "What happens next?" And there's already a sense of the younger players are maybe not quite as good as England thought they were going to be, and that they haven't forced out the older players in a way that perhaps England might have hoped by this point. And you don't look at England, occasionally you'll get a player who'll come out and they'll have a good couple of years of the blast. Everyone will get really excited about them. Then they go and play franchise cricket, and actually they don't dominate franchise cricket. They quite often come back to the pack and struggle a little bit. It doesn't feel to me like there is a second generation that will come through. That what we will have, of course, is they'll have all the advantages of thinking better about the game, of having a very good style of play, of having a lot of the same advantages you talk about, playing a lot of T20 cricket. Like if you're a young England player now, you can play in the 100 and you can play in the blast, right? So there's still a lot of advantages out there, but it doesn't look like the next generation is anywhere near what this generation is right at the moment.
So one of the things with golden generations, as you said, is because they play for so long together. One of the reasons why golden generation is so good, because they play international sport and they're exposed at a young age. By definition, if you have one golden generation, it makes it hard for the next one. And if you look at England's openers now, actually, you could say England's four best white ball openers: Alex Hales, who's just retired; Jason Roy, Johnny Bairstow, Dawid Malan, and Jos Buttler in T20 cricket. They're all aged 32 or over. So that's showing that there's a bit of a clog there. But then you do look at guys as Will Jacks, for example, who might not even be in the World Cup squad. He's a really, really talented player. He's done well in leagues around the world. I think there was 70 English players played in franchise cricket last winter. So I think, no, there are reasons to be optimistic, but I don't think, we say in the book that to be as successful as England have been, England have really been the best team in both ODIs and T20s, I'd argue, since 2015 as a whole, which is
definitely
an incredible achievement. So that's probably not going to be sustainable forever, as Australia, they're gone, their brilliant era, as that showed. I think England will never, I'm confident England will never go back to being what they were before 2015, which is this sort of rabble who would get to the quarterfinals and sometimes not even that, as we know. England have got to a place now where to get to the last four of the World Cup will always be regarded as par, really, no more. So for now, that's where England are at, which is a brilliant achievement. Whether they can keep this going with a new group of players is the question. But it is worth saying that only 6 members of the World Cup 2019 squad were there in Australia last year when they won the T20 World Cup. So it's actually, there has been an element of natural churn as well. So it has been more than just a brilliant kind of small group of players. There is still the broader factors are still in England's favour, one of which is luck, which is that their schedule allows them to play a full first-class season and then a series of leagues around the world. If you're an young Australian, you can't actually play in as many leagues as a young English player without sacrificing your first-class career. So actually, those sorts of advantages remain with England. England are obviously, they're a rich cricket board, which is very useful, very important, and they weren't making the most of that before. So yeah, I'm confident England will remain at a good level going forward. But yeah, clearly when you have so many very good players in their 30s, they do kind of leave that generation, that kind of mid-20s generation, who just wouldn't have had as much experience as these guys had equivalently, 8 years ago. So I don't think England will. No one's going to keep being at this level forever, but England, I don't think England are going back to pre-2015. I think England is still going to basically be a very good, very competitive team going forward, and that is the legacy of this golden generation that is going to go far beyond their own careers.
Thanks for coming on the podcast.